In 1948, a young African king married a white Englishwoman in a quiet London registry office. Within months, Britain had effectively exiled him from his own kingdom, not because he had broken any law, but because his marriage threatened British diplomacy, South Africa's apartheid government, and powerful mining interests. 9 years later, that same man returned home, led his country to independence, and transformed one of the poorest nations on earth into one of Africa's greatest development success stories. His name was Seretse Khama. Welcome to Peak World. If you're new, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Seretse Khama was born on the 1st of July 1921 in Serowe, the capital of the Bamangwato people, in what was then the British protectorate of Bechuanaland. He was born into one of Southern Africa's most respected royal families. His grandfather, Khama III, had become one of the region's most influential rulers after embracing Christianity, modernizing his kingdom, and successfully resisting repeated attempts by Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company to seize Bamangwato territory. Seretse's father, Sekgoma II, ruled as king for only a short time before dying in 1925, when Seretse was just 4 years old. The young prince therefore became heir to the throne while still a child. Because he was too young to rule, his uncle, Seretse Khama, became regent and governed the kingdom on his behalf. Seretse proved to be a capable but deeply traditional leader. He was determined to prepare Seretse for kingship while preserving the customs and authority of the Bamangwato people. Seretse attended Tiger Kloof Educational Institute in South Africa before studying at Fort Hare University College, one of the leading institutions for black students in Southern Africa. He later moved to England, where he studied law at Balliol College, Oxford, and completed his legal training at the Inner Temple in London. In 1947, at a dance organized by the London Missionary Society, that Seretse met Ruth Williams, an Englishwoman from Blackheath in South London who had served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force during the war and now worked as a clerk at Lloyd's of London. The two fell in love, and on September 30th, 1948, they married in a Kensington registry office. In this, Seretse was unlike many of his contemporaries. At a time when other African leaders had grown up under colonial systems that constantly reinforced the idea of white superiority, Seretse simply saw Ruth as his wife and life partner, an attitude that would become very visible in how he governed later on. It should have been a private matter. Instead, it set off one of the most extraordinary political storms of the post-war British Empire. Back home, Seretse's uncle Tshekedi was furious and demanded that Seretse return and have the marriage annulled, insisting that as a king, he was expected to marry an African woman, ideally one of royal blood. But the real danger came from further south. South Africa, which had banned interracial marriage under its own apartheid laws just a year earlier, made clear it would not accept an interracial couple ruling a neighboring territory on its border. The South African Prime Minister, Daniel Francois D.F. Malan, publicly called the marriage disgusting. Britain was unwilling to jeopardize its relationship with South Africa, a vital trading and strategic partner, particularly for gold and uranium. Britain's influence in the region had been shaped by the Anglo-Boer War, the creation of the Union of South Africa, and, more recently, the 1948 election victory of South Africa's National Party, which had moved swiftly to introduce apartheid. Given all this, Britain began looking for a way to prevent Seretse from taking his throne. When Seretse returned home with Ruth, something remarkable happened. The Bamangwato people welcomed her. At a series of gotlas, traditional public assemblies that function as community councils and customary courts among Setswana and Sotho communities in southern Africa, the tribe overwhelmingly voted to accept Seretse as their king and Ruth as his wife, despite his uncle's opposition. Faced with this loss of support, Chekedi left for self-imposed exile. But the British government hadn't given up. In 1950, they summoned Seretse to London for what he was told were routine discussions. It was a trap. Once there, he was informed that he would not be allowed to return home. Ruth, who was pregnant at the time and had wanted to give birth on Bamangwato soil as tradition demanded for a future king, later said she had a premonition they were going to keep him there. The British government did commission a judicial inquiry into whether Seretse was fit to rule. The findings were unambiguous. He was, in the inquiry's own words, eminently fit to rule the Bamangwato. The only problem was his marriage, which stood in the way of good relations with the Apartheid governments on Bechuanaland's borders. Rather than let that finding see the light of day, the British government suppressed the report entirely. It would not be made public for 30 years. Seretse and Ruth were banished from Bechuanaland and forced to live in exile in England. The exile stretched on for 6 years. Seretse, by his wife's account, struggled with depression during this period, at times sitting silently by the fire for hours. Yet even from exile, he refused to abandon either his wife or his people's cause, and back home in Bechuanaland, popular support for his return never faded. In 1956, after the Bamangwato people petitioned Queen Elizabeth II directly, the British government finally relented and allowed the couple to return, but only after Seretse agreed to formally renounce his claim to the throne. He came home not as a king, but as a private citizen who had chosen his family over power. It would prove to be the making of him as a statesman rather than a monarch. Seretse settled into life as a cattle farmer in Serowe and gradually became involved in local and territorial politics, first quietly, then with growing purpose. In 1962, he founded the Bechuanaland Democratic Party, later renamed the Botswana Democratic Party following the country's independence in 1966. 3 years after founding it, in 1965, he was elected Prime Minister of the Colonial Transitional Government. On September 30, 1966, Bechuanaland became independent as the Republic of Botswana, with Seretse Khama as its first president. In recognition of the man Britain had once exiled, he was also knighted, becoming Sir Seretse Khama. Unlike many of the era's other founding fathers, Khama had little interest in the Marxist-inflected politics that shaped much of the newly independent continent. He was, by most accounts, a pragmatist above all. His successor, President Festus Mogae, later described him simply as a liberal, and it's a label that fits. The country he inherited was, by most measures, among the poorest in the world, landlocked, heavily in debt to Britain, and with almost no infrastructure to speak of. What followed over the next 14 years was one of the most remarkable transformations in African economic history. The discovery of major diamond deposits was the turning point, but the transformation wasn't automatic. It came from how Khama's government chose to manage that wealth. Where many resource-rich nations found mineral wealth a curse that fueled corruption and civil war, Khama's government took a different path. Rather than letting narrow elites extract the profits, it built a transparent system designed to protect that wealth and fund public infrastructure, health, and education. In 1969, Botswana renegotiated its customs union with South Africa, securing a larger share of mining revenue for itself. In 1975, as the full scale of the diamond wealth became clear, it renegotiated again to guarantee the government a full 50% of mining revenues. By the mid-1970s, those changes had pushed Botswana into a budget surplus. The cattle industry also received heavy state support. The government nationalized the country's one existing slaughterhouse, built 2 more, and subsidized veterinary services, vaccines, and fencing for herders. It also created the Botswana Meat Commission as the sole seller of the country's beef, giving the state control over pricing in both regional and international markets. With Khama's direct involvement, Botswana negotiated a trade deal with the European Economic Community that secured prices well above the prevailing world rate. Beyond natural resources and agriculture, Khama led a national fundraising drive to build the country's first institute of higher education, an effort that culminated in the founding of the University of Botswana in 1982, 2 years after his death. In 1970, the government established the Botswana Development Corporation to attract foreign investment into agriculture, tourism and manufacturing, and in 1976 it introduced the Botswana Pula as the national currency, replacing the South African rand. Unlike many of his counterparts across the newly independent continent, Khama built a functioning multi-party democracy and held regular elections, all while surrounded by white minority governments in South Africa and Rhodesia and a deeply unstable region. He also played a significant diplomatic role in negotiations over Rhodesia's transition to majority rule and independence as Zimbabwe, lending Botswana's quiet credibility to one of the region's most difficult political transitions. He later helped establish what would become the Southern African Development Community, SADC, headquartered in Botswana. Notably, he also chose not to move against Botswana's white residents or seize their property after independence, a restraint that set his government apart from several of its regional neighbors. Khama's legacy of national unity has proven durable. Despite the Bamangwato being the majority tribe within the country, the vision Seretse set out helped establish a political culture where Botswana have generally voted on merit rather than along tribal lines, a striking contrast with much of the rest of the continent. Botswana's current president, Duma Boko, is himself of Xhosa heritage, and in 2024, his opposition coalition unseated the Botswana Democratic Party, the party Khama himself founded, ending nearly 6 decades of BDP rule. The transfer of power was peaceful, and the country remained stable throughout, a testament to just how deeply Khama's democratic institutions had taken root. In his final years, Khama's health declined steadily. He had been diagnosed with diabetes in 1960 and underwent heart surgery in Johannesburg in 1976 to have a pacemaker fitted, after which he travelled to London regularly for treatment. In June 1980, while being treated in London, he was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. Once doctors determined there was no possible cure, he chose to return home. Seretse Khama served as president until his death on July 13, 1980, at the age of 59, dying, notably, in the country he had led, rather than abroad. His wife Ruth remained in Botswana until her own death in 2002, honored by the Bamangwato people as Mohumagadi Makagosi, Mother of the King. In 1979, the Bamangwato and Seretse crowned his eldest son, Ian Khama, onto the royal throne with the regal title Khama IV. Because Ian was serving in the military at the time, regents filled the role until late November 2024, when Lieutenant General Ian Khama, who had also served as commander of the Botswana Defence Force and later as Botswana's 4th president from 2008 to 2018, formally took over his royal seat. Seretse's royal bloodline, tracing back to the 16th century ruler Mangwato, still reigns among the Bamangwato today. The love story that once threatened to unravel relations across the British Commonwealth ultimately became the founding story of one of Africa's most stable and enduring democracies. Proof, in Khama's own case, that the marriage his enemies once called a scandal was in fact the beginning of a legacy. Do you think Seretse Khama is the most underrated leader in Africa? A man who put his nation ahead of his own family? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Peak World content.